The highway stretched endlessly ahead, a long, desolate ribbon of asphalt cutting through the vast American landscape. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving behind a sky painted in deep hues of purple and navy. Stars began piercing the darkening expanse, but the world below remained quiet, save for the distant hum of a truck's engine somewhere far down the road. Chuck Norris guided his battle-worn pickup down the desolate stretch of highway, his grip firm on the wheel. The night was calm, but he knew better than to trust it. Experience had taught him that peace was often an illusion, just the quiet before the storm. He had spent his life in motion, always moving, always prepared. Tonight was no different. The radio crackled with an old country song, slow and full of longing, the kind that spoke of open roads and memories best left behind. Chuck barely noticed the lyrics. His focus remained on the drive, on the steady hum of his tires rolling over the endless asphalt. The dashboard clock glowed past midnight. He had been driving for hours, and though fatigue hadn't caught up to him yet, he figured a short break wouldn't hurt. That was when he saw it. A flickering neon sign up ahead, standing alone in the darkness like a beacon for weary travelers. It was the only sign of life for miles, a roadside bar, one of those places where truckers, drifters, and small-town locals came for a drink, a meal, or just a place to stop before disappearing back into the highway. Chuck eased off the gas, letting his truck glide toward the entrance. The lot wasn't crowded. An old semi sat parked near the back, a few battered pickups closer to the front, and a cluster of motorcycles lined up near the entrance. He studied the bikes for a moment, then let it go. He'd seen enough places like this to know the type that usually hung around. Some were just passing through, others were looking for trouble. He parked, killed the engine, and stepped out, stretching his legs. The air was thick with dust and the distant scent of rain, the kind of smell that signaled a storm brewing somewhere on the horizon. He glanced up, catching the slow creep of dark clouds rolling in from the west, then turned his attention to the bar. The building had seen better days. Its wooden exterior was cracked and faded, the windows clouded with years of neglect. The neon sign overhead buzzed faintly, barely holding on as it cast a red glow over the gravel lot. The name read, Big Al's Roadhouse. Chuck didn't hesitate. He had been in worse places. He pushed open the heavy door and stepped inside. The scent of beer, grilled meat, and cigarette smoke greeted him, a mix that told him everything he needed to know. This wasn't a place for the faint of heart. Dim lights hung low, their glow uneven against the worn wooden floors. A jukebox in the corner played a faded rock song, barely audible over the murmur of voices and occasional bursts of laughter. A handful of patrons filled the room. An older trucker hunched over the bar, nursing a whiskey. A couple of locals were near the back, playing pool. And then there were them. The kind Chuck had seen 100 times before. And he knew the night was far from over. In the farthest corner of the bar, a group of men sat sprawled around a table, their leather jackets worn and faded, adorned with patches from long-forgotten bands. Their presence was impossible to ignore. They spoke loudly, their laughter grating against the low hum of conversation, their jokes amusing only to themselves. Boots were propped up on chairs, empty beer bottles cluttering the table in front of them. Chuck didn't need to get any closer to recognize their type. These weren't bikers, the kind with codes and loyalty, men who lived by a creed. No, these were rockers, the kind who carried themselves like they owned the room. They weren't here to ride. They were here to remind everyone who was in charge. He ignored them. Chuck walked to the bar, took a seat at the counter, and nodded toward the bartender, a burly man with graying hair and tired eyes. "Coffee," Chuck said simply. The bartender studied him for a moment, then gave a slow nod before pouring the drink. Chuck sat in silence, listening. Experience had taught him that trouble always announced itself before it arrived, and tonight he could feel it brewing. It was coming from the far corner of the room. Their stares were unmistakable. A glance here, a muttered comment there, a quiet chuckle at his expense. Chuck didn't need to hear the words to know what they were saying. He already knew. They were sizing him up. He took a slow sip of coffee, letting the warmth spread through him. He wasn't here to start trouble, but he also knew he wouldn't be the one to decide that. He had seen this unfold too many times before. The atmosphere in the bar shifted, the air thick with an unspoken challenge. A chair scraped against the floor. Heavy boots moved across the wooden planks, deliberate and unhurried. The first approach. Chuck didn't turn. He simply waited. A large man stopped just a few feet away, close enough that Chuck could smell the stale mix of beer and cigarettes on his clothes. Silence stretched between them. Then the voice came. "You lost, old man?" Chuck set his cup down and finally turned his head, just enough to get a look at the man. He was tall, broad-shouldered, thick around the middle, the kind of strength that had long since softened from too many years of easy victories and heavy drinking. His leather jacket bore a faded emblem on the back, some forgotten band's logo, a relic of a past that had never gone anywhere. The rocker smiled, but there was no humor in it. He was testing the waters, pushing. Chuck met his gaze for a moment, then turned back to his coffee. No. A simple answer. Dismissive. And that was enough to set things in motion. In the farthest corner of the bar, the other rockers lounged in worn leather jackets, their presence impossible to ignore. Patches and faded logos from long-dead bands covered their backs. Their voices carried over the low murmur of the room, loud, confident, and full of unchecked arrogance. Laughter erupted at their own jokes, boots propped up on chairs, empty beer bottles scattered across the table. Chuck didn't need to get close to know their type. These weren't bikers. Not the kind who lived by a code, who rode for something bigger than themselves. These were rockers, the kind who strutted into a place like they owned it. They weren't here to ride. They were here to remind everyone who was in charge. He ignored them. Chuck walked to the bar, took a seat, and gave a slight nod to the bartender, a burly man with graying hair and tired eyes. "Coffee," Chuck said simply. The bartender studied him for a moment, measuring him the way men like him did. Then, with a small nod, he poured the drink. Chuck sat in silence, listening. Experience had taught him that trouble always announced itself before it arrived. And tonight, it was coming from the far corner of the room. He could feel their eyes on him, glances, whispers, low chuckles. They were sizing him up. Chuck took a slow sip of coffee, letting the warmth settle in his chest. He wasn't here to start a fight, but he knew deep down he wouldn't be the one deciding that. He had seen this play out too many times before. The tension in the bar thickened, the air growing heavier with an unspoken challenge lingering between Chuck and the men in the corner. It was only a matter of time. Behind him, the rockers were getting restless. They weren't outright hostile, not yet. But the moment he had walked in, the atmosphere had changed. He could feel their stares pressing against his back, the subtle shift in their conversation, low murmurs, a few snide remarks, and laughter that didn't sound friendly. It was bravado, the kind that came from men who had spent too much time being the biggest threat in the room. The bartender set Chuck's coffee in front of him, wiping his hands on a rag before leaning slightly over the counter. His voice was low, meant only for Chuck. "You sure you want to be here?" Chuck lifted the cup to his lips, taking a slow sip before answering. "Just passing through." The bartender hesitated, glancing past Chuck's shoulder toward the far end of the bar, then back at him. "Might want to keep it that way." Chuck didn't respond. He didn't need to. Then a chair scraped against the floor. Heavy boots moved across the wooden planks. Deliberate, unhurried, the first approach. Chuck didn't turn around. He simply waited. A large man stopped just a few feet away, close enough that Chuck could smell the stale mix of beer and cigarettes clinging to his clothes. Silence hung between them, thick and expectant. Then the voice came, low and edged with challenge. "You lost, old man?" Chuck set his cup down, finally turning his head just enough to get a look at the man. Tall, broad-shouldered, thick around the middle, the kind of build that had once been solid muscle but had softened from too many years of easy victories and heavy drinking. His leather jacket bore a faded emblem, some defunct band's logo, a relic of a past that had never quite lived up to its own legend. The rocker smiled, but there was no humor in it. He was testing the waters, pushing to see how far he could go. Chuck held his gaze for a long moment. Then, without a word, he turned back to his coffee. A simple response, dismissive, and that was enough to set things in motion. A second man joined the first, his approach even bolder. He was leaner, younger, but his smirk carried the same arrogance. He leaned against the bar beside Chuck, too close for it to be anything but intentional. "The fact," he said, his grin widening. "See, thing is, this ain't really a place for—" He trailed off, choosing his words carefully, giving Chuck a slow, deliberate once-overs. Chuck didn't need to hear the rest. He already knew exactly where that sentence was going. Before the younger rocker could push further, another voice cut through the tension, slicing through the room with an authority that couldn't be ignored. "That's enough." The words were calm, almost casual, but there was an unmistakable weight behind them. The two rockers hesitated, exchanging quick glances, before stepping aside. Chuck turned slightly, finally getting a clear look at the man who had spoken. Nick Calloway. Even seated, Nick commanded attention. His long, graying hair was pulled back into a loose ponytail, and a thick but well-maintained beard framed his jaw. His black leather jacket had seen its share of fights, the sleeves pushed up to reveal tattooed forearms, each mark telling a story. Unlike the others, Nick didn't look amused. He exhaled a slow breath, then leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. His sharp, assessing gaze locked onto Chuck. "I don't think our friend here meant any harm." Nick studied him, waiting for an answer. Chuck didn't rush. He took another slow sip of coffee, noting the way the others deferred to this man, the leader. "No harm intended," Chuck finally said. Nick nodded slightly, as if weighing the words. Then, with a smirk, he turned back to his men. "You see, the man's just here for coffee." He let out a chuckle, shaking his head. "Ain't that something?" The tension should have eased. It didn't. Even as Nick leaned back in his chair, even as he gestured for his men to step away, Chuck knew what was coming next. He had been in too many rooms like this before. Nick Calloway was the kind of man who thrived on being the center of attention, and Chuck's presence threatened that balance. He wasn't afraid, and that alone made him a problem. Just beyond Chuck's peripheral vision, someone stepped too close, closer than necessary. The heavy scent of beer and cigarettes clung to his clothes, thick and unmistakable. The air between them tensed, stretching in silence. Then came the voice, low and laced with challenge. "You lost, old man." Chuck set his cup down, finally turning his head just enough to get a good look at the man. He was tall, broad-shouldered, thick around the middle, the kind of strength that had once been solid muscle but had softened from years of easy victories and heavy drinking. His leather jacket bore a faded emblem from some forgotten band that had likely never made it big. The rocker smiled, but there was no humor behind it. He was testing the waters, seeing just how far he could push. Chuck met his gaze, holding it for a moment. Then, without a word, he turned back to his coffee. "No." A simple response, dismissive, and that was enough to set things in motion. A second man stepped forward, younger and leaner but carrying the same cocky arrogance. He moved in beside Chuck, standing too close for it to be anything but intentional. "The fact," the younger one said, his grin widening. "See, thing is, this ain't really a place for—" He let his words trail off, giving Chuck a slow, deliberate once-overs, making his meaning clear. Chuck didn't need to hear the rest. He already knew exactly where that sentence was going. The younger rocker smirked, confident he had the upper hand. But before he could push any further, another voice cut through the room, sharp and decisive. "That's enough." The tone was calm but edged with finality. Both rockers hesitated. Then, almost reluctantly, they stepped aside. Chuck turned slightly, finally getting a clear look at the man who had spoken. Mason "Thunder" Calloway. Even seated, Mason had a presence that demanded attention. His long, graying hair was pulled back into a loose ponytail, and his beard, thick but well-maintained, added to his rugged, no-nonsense look. His black leather jacket, scuffed and worn from years of use, had its sleeves pushed up, revealing tattooed forearms marked with stories of the past. Unlike the others, Mason wasn't smirking or sizing Chuck up like a casual threat. He wasn't amused. He exhaled a slow breath, then leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table, his sharp gaze locking onto Chuck with quiet scrutiny. "I don't think our friend here meant any harm," he said, his voice calm but measured. "Did you, cowboy?" Chuck didn't answer right away. Instead, he studied Mason, taking in the way he carried himself, the way the others deferred to him without a word. He was the leader, the kind of man who had spent years at the top, not just because of his strength, but because no one had dared to challenge him in a long, long time. Chuck lifted his coffee, took another slow sip, and set the cup back down. "No harm intended," he finally said. Mason nodded, as if weighing the words. Then, with a smirk, he turned back to his men. "You see, the man's just here for coffee." He let out a chuckle, shaking his head slightly. "That's something." The tension in the room should have eased. It didn't. Even as Mason leaned back in his chair, gesturing for his men to step away, Chuck knew what was coming next. He had been in too many rooms like this before. Mason Calloway was the kind of man who needed to be the center of attention, and Chuck's presence disrupted that balance. He wasn't afraid, and that made him a problem. Mason wasn't finished. He picked up his beer, took a slow sip, then set the bottle down with a deliberate thud. "But you know," he said, his tone shifting, his smirk widening. "It's funny, a man like you walks into a place like this, and it makes you wonder." Chuck stayed silent. Mason tilted his head slightly, watching him. "Makes you wonder why he thinks he can just walk in and not show respect." The word respect lingered in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Behind Chuck, one of the rockers let out a low chuckle, the sound laced with amusement and something darker. Chuck exhaled slowly through his nose. He had hoped this wouldn't turn into a problem, but it always did. Mason was waiting, expecting a reaction. When Chuck didn't give him one, Mason leaned forward, the amusement in his eyes fading into something sharper. "I'll tell you what, cowboy," Mason said, his voice quieter now, more dangerous. "Since you're new around here, maybe we'll give you a chance. Show some respect, buy the boys around, and maybe we all forget this happened." Chuck didn't move, didn't blink. Then, slowly, deliberately, he reached into his pocket. The men around him tensed, anticipating something. Cash, maybe? Or something else. But when Chuck's hand came back up, it was empty. He placed it flat on the bar, his fingers steady. Then finally he spoke. "I don't buy drinks for men I don't respect." The silence that followed was absolute. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Then, without warning, a chair scraped back violently. One of the younger rockers lunged forward, his temper snapping. His hand shot out, aiming to grab Chuck by the collar. He never got the chance. In a blur, Chuck's hand snapped up, catching the man's wrist in an iron grip. A heartbeat later, he twisted for sharp, controlled, forcing the rocker to stumble forward. Before he could recover, Chuck drove his knee into the man's ribs, knocking the air out of him. He let go, and the younger rocker crumpled to the floor, gasping for breath. The bar fell silent for a heartbeat. Then chaos erupted. Trouble always had a way of finding Chuck, no matter how much he tried to avoid it. As the tension in the bar thickened, Chuck remained calm, his fingers tapping the rim of his coffee cup before he set it down. His voice was steady, unshaken. Don't start trouble. But Mason Calloway wasn't interested in words. He wasn't looking for reason. He wanted a reaction. His smirk faded. His jaw tightened. Then, with slow, deliberate intent, he reached out and knocked Chuck's coffee cup off the bar. The ceramic shattered against the wooden floor, the spilled coffee spreading like ink in the dim light. Silence followed. Thick. Expectant. Chuck lifted his gaze, meeting Mason's eyes as the man leaned back in his chair, grinning. "Well now," Mason murmured, his voice taunting. "What do you think about that, cowboy?" Chuck already knew how this was going to end. He had seen this play out too many times before. Men like Mason, fueled by arrogance and bravado, always looking to prove something. The air in the room had changed. No more casual conversations. No more sidelong glances. Every eye was locked on them, waiting for what would happen next. Mason's men adjusted their positions, shifting slightly, hands drifting near their belts, their bodies angling like men preparing for a fight. But Chuck Norris wasn't weak, and he wasn't afraid. He let out a slow exhale, his expression unreadable, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a few bills. Without a word, he placed them on the counter, a quiet acknowledgement of the coffee he never got to drink. For a moment it seemed like he might simply stand and leave, but that wasn't what Mason or his crew wanted. A sharp snicker cut through the silence, a mocking sound from one of the younger rockers. That was all it took. A stool scraped against the floor, and movement flickered in Chuck's peripheral vision. A large, heavy-set man stepped toward him from the left, the first to test the waters. He didn't throw a punch, not yet. Instead, he gave Chuck a hard shove on the shoulder, pushing for a reaction. Chuck didn't budge. The rocker's grin widened, emboldened by the lack of response. "Looks like the old man's got some sense," he muttered. Then he shoved Chuck again, harder this time. That was his mistake. Chuck's hand shot out like a whip, fingers clamping around the man's wrist in an iron grip. There was no hesitation, no wasted motion. With a sharp twist, he forced the rocker's arm inward, making him stumble forward. Chuck's knees shot up, driving hard into the man's ribs. A choked gasp escaped as the air rushed from his lungs. Chuck let go, allowing him to crumple to the ground, gasping for breath. The bar froze for a heartbeat. Then, chaos erupted. Another man lunged, swinging a fist toward Chuck's head. Chuck ducked, sidestepped, and drove an elbow into the attacker's jaw, sending him crashing into an empty table. The impact shattered beer bottles, glass, scattering across the floor. A third rushed in, wielding a broken pool cue like a weapon. Chuck caught his wrist mid-swing, twisted sharply, and the makeshift club clattered to the ground. In the same motion, Chuck's fist slammed into his gut, doubling him over. Before he could recover, Chuck sent him sprawling with a well-placed shove. The room exploded with movement. Uninvolved patrons scrambled out of the way, chairs and tables overturning in the frenzy. Somewhere in the distance, the bartender ducked behind the counter, wisely keeping out of it. Two more rockers charged together, convinced that their numbers would give them the advantage. The first threw a wild punch. Chuck easily sidestepped, caught the man's arm, and drove a fist deep into his ribs. The second barely had time to react before Chuck's boot connected with his knee, dropping him to the floor with a sharp cry. It was over in seconds. The bodies of Mason's men lay groaning on the ground, some clutching their ribs, others rolling onto their backs, struggling to catch their breath. The entire fight had lasted no more than a handful of heartbeats. But the outcome was undeniable. The rockers had lost. And yet, Chuck knew it wasn't over. Because Mason hadn't moved. The leader of the group remained seated, watching. His expression was unreadable. Mason Calloway had played his hand carefully. He had let his men attack first, let them test the stranger, and let them fail. Now, as the dust settled and his crew lay groaning on the floor, Mason finally leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. His sharp, calculating gaze locked onto Chuck, studying him with renewed interest. Chuck met his stare without flinching, waiting. Mason exhaled slowly, rubbing his jaw before shaking his head. "Well," he muttered, a hint of something between amusement and irritation in his tone. "Looks like we got ourselves a real tough guy." Chuck didn't respond. He didn't need to. Mason stood, rolling his shoulders. Unlike his men, there was no hesitation in his movements, no uncertainty. He was taller than Chuck, broader, a man who had spent years winning fights and walking away on top. And unlike the others, he wasn't going to make the mistake of underestimating his opponent. He cracked his knuckles, taking a slow step forward. "Let's see how tough you really are." The real fight was about to begin. The bar had already descended into chaos. What had once been a dimly lit, quiet roadhouse was now a battleground of overturned tables and broken chairs. Chuck Norris stood steady in the wreckage, moving with a precision that made it clear he had done this before. A few uninvolved patrons had scrambled to the corners, pressing themselves against the walls. The bartender had wisely ducked behind the counter, keeping himself out of the line of fire. Two more rockers lunged at Chuck, convinced their numbers would give them the advantage. The first swung wildly, his punch fueled by frustration rather than skill. Chuck sidestepped with ease, catching the man's arm mid-air before driving his fist into his exposed ribs. The attacker let out a choked gasp as he stumbled backward, clutching his side. The second barely had time to react before Chuck's boot connected with his knee, sending him crumpling to the ground with a sharp cry of pain. It was over in seconds. Bodies lay sprawled across the floor, groaning in pain, some clutching their ribs, others rolling onto their backs, gasping for breath. The entire fight had lasted no more than a handful of heartbeats, but the outcome was undeniable. The rockers were beaten, and yet Chuck knew it wasn't over, because Mason Calloway still hadn't moved. The leader of the group remained seated, watching with an expression that gave nothing away. Unlike his men, who had charged in blindly, Mason had stayed back, observing, studying. He had let them test Chuck first, and now he had his answer. Slowly, Mason leaned forward again, his forearms resting on the table. Chuck turned his gaze toward him, waiting. A slow breath left Mason's lips before he shook his head. "Well," he muttered, as if speaking more to himself than anyone else. "Looks like we got ourselves a real tough guy." Chuck remained silent, his posture relaxed but ready. Mason straightened, rolling his shoulders as he stood. There was no hesitation in his movements, no sign of nerves or doubt. He was taller than Chuck, broader, a man who had spent years in fights and had walked away victorious more times than not. And unlike the others, he wasn't reckless. He reached down, grabbed a chair, and casually swung it around, setting it upright before him. Then, with that same unsettling smirk, he cracked his knuckles and took a step forward. "Let's see how tough you really are." Mason Calloway stood motionless for a long moment, rolling his shoulders, taking his time. He wasn't like the rest of them. He was in no hurry. He knew how to read an opponent, and he had been watching Chuck closely. The way the stranger moved, the way he had handled each attack with precision, no wasted motion, no hesitation, it told Mason everything he needed to know. This wasn't some ordinary man passing through town. He wasn't some lost traveler or an unlucky drifter who had wandered into the wrong bar at the wrong time. His PTSD actually helped him. And that meant only one thing. This was about to get interesting. No, Chuck Norris was something different, something dangerous, and Mason Calloway wanted to test him. The silence in the bar hung thick, heavy with anticipation. The only sounds were the muffled groans of Mason's men sprawled across the floor, struggling to catch their breath after the swift, brutal beating they had just endured. The few remaining patrons, truckers, drifters, and locals, who had wisely stayed out of the fight, stood frozen, their backs pressed against the walls, their drinks forgotten. No one dared to move. No one wanted to draw attention to themselves. They had seen enough to know that whatever happened next would be the real show. Chuck didn't move first. He remained exactly where he was, calm, steady, his breathing even. He had been in situations like this before. He knew what was coming next. Mason flexed his fingers once, then took a slow step forward. His boots made a heavy sound against the wooden floor, each step deliberate, measured. His eyes never left Chuck's. For a moment it seemed as though he might speak, but then, without warning, he struck. He moved faster than a man his size should have been able to, his fist cutting through the air in a powerful arc, aimed directly at Chuck's jaw. But Chuck had already anticipated it. He tilted his head just slightly, letting the punch sail past him by mere inches, the force of the swing disturbing the air beside him. Mason's momentum carried him forward, and Chuck took the opening. His palm shot out, striking Mason's chest with enough force to send him stumbling back a step. It wasn't enough to drop him, not yet, but it was a message, a warning. Mason's smirk returned. "All right," he muttered under his breath. Then he charged. The fight exploded into motion. Mason swung again, and this time Chuck blocked the strike, catching the man's wrist in a vice-like grip. He twisted, applying pressure to the joint, but Mason was stronger than the others had been. He powered through the hold, yanking his arm free before immediately driving his knee up toward Chuck's ribs. Chuck twisted his body at the last second, absorbing some of the impact but lessening the damage. Pain flared through his side, but he ignored it. Pain was nothing new. Mason pressed the attack, throwing another punch, then another. His strikes were heavy, forceful, relentless. Chuck dodged, sidestepped, deflected where he could, but Mason was aggressive, unyielding. Unlike the others, he wasn't relying on intimidation. He was fighting to win. He fought like a man who had spent his life throwing punches and taking them in return. Every movement was seasoned with experience, every strike a product of countless brawls. A bottle shattered somewhere behind them. Someone shouted. The bartender's voice rang out, demanding they take it outside, but his words were distant, drowned out by the tension in the room. None of it mattered now. Mason feinted left, then lunged, aiming a hard hook at Chuck's ribs. Chuck reacted instantly, blocking with his forearm before snapping forward. His fist drove into Mason's stomach with enough force to make the bigger man grunt. Mason staggered back, but barely for a second. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, then grinned. "Not bad," he admitted. Then, without hesitation, he reached down, grabbed a bar stool, and swung it with all his strength. Chuck ducked. The wooden seat sliced through the air, missing him by inches, but Mason wasn't finished. He adjusted his grip on the stool, twisted his body, and brought it down in a powerful overhead swing. Chuck had no choice but to step back. The stool smashed into the floor where he had been standing a second ago, the impact sending splinters flying across the room. Mason tossed the broken stool aside. "Come on," he taunted. "Thought you were tough." Chuck didn't respond. He didn't need to. Instead, he moved. Mason Calloway was stronger than the others. Chuck could feel it in the way the man powered through holes, breaking free with sheer brute strength. The moment his wrist was loose, Mason drove his knee up, aiming for Chuck's ribs. Chuck twisted his body at the last second, absorbing most of the impact, but not all of it. A sharp pain flared through his side, a stark reminder that this fight wasn't going to be like the others. But pain was nothing new. Chuck had fought through worse. Mason didn't give him time to recover. He pressed forward, throwing another punch, then another, each strike heavy, forceful, relentless. Chuck dodged, sidestepped, and deflected where he could, but Mason wasn't like his men. He wasn't just another loudmouth trying to prove himself through bravado or intimidation. He fought to win. A bottle shattered somewhere behind them. Someone shouted. The bartender's voice rang out again, telling them to take it outside, but neither of them paid attention. Mason feinted left, then lunged again, this time with even more speed and precision. Chuck blocked the shot with his forearm, then countered, driving his fist deep into Mason's stomach. The impact made the bigger man grunt as he stumbled back. But it wasn't enough to keep him down. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, that same unsettling grin still stretched across his face. "Not bad," Mason admitted. Then, without hesitation, he reached down, grabbed a bar stool, and swung it with all his strength. The wooden seat sliced through the air, aimed directly at Chuck's head. He ducked, narrowly avoiding the impact, but Mason wasn't done. Twisting his grip, he raised the stool again, bringing it down in a powerful overhead swing. Chuck had no choice but to step back. The stool slammed into the floor where he had been standing a second ago, the force of the impact splintering the wood. Mason tossed the broken remains aside and took a step forward, his smirk returning. "Come on," he goaded. "Thought you were tough." Chuck didn't answer. Instead, he moved. In an instant, he closed the distance, his boots snapping forward and striking Mason's knee. The bigger man let out a sharp grunt as his leg buckled, and in that moment of weakness, Chuck struck again. A punch to the ribs. Another to the jaw. Mason staggered, his balance shifting, but he didn't fall. He let out a low growl, shaking his head, trying to clear it. Then, with renewed fury, he lunged. This time he tackled Chuck, driving him back against the bar with the full weight of his body. Bottles rattled on the shelves behind them as Chuck felt the solid wood press into his spine. Mason was strong, no doubt about it, but Chuck had been in this position before. And he didn't let the disadvantage last. He brought his elbow down hard on the back of Mason's neck, once, twice. Mason's grip loosened just enough for Chuck to slip free. Spinning, Chuck caught Mason by the collar of his leather jacket, and with a sharp twist of his hips, he sent the man crashing over the bar counter. Mason hit the floor behind the bar with a heavy thud, knocking over bottles and glasses as he rolled onto his side. The bartender swore loudly, but neither fighter paid him any mind. Chuck took a step back, breathing evenly, his stance still solid, still unshaken. He had seen fights like this before. They were never over until the other man stayed down. And Mason wasn't staying down. The big man groaned, pushing himself up from the floor. For a moment he just stood there, his chest rising and falling with deep, heavy breaths. His body ached from the beating, but his pride had taken the worst hit. Slowly he lifted his head, his eyes locking onto Chuck. The smirk that had once carried so much arrogance was gone. He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "You should have just finished your coffee," he muttered. Then his hand moved. Fast, but not fast enough. Chuck saw it before anyone else. Mason's fingers darted toward his belt, reaching for the handle of a knife. The blade gleamed under the dim bar lights, a flash of cold steel. That was Mason's final mistake. Chuck didn't hesitate. Before Mason could even bring the knife up, Chuck closed the distance in a single step. His hand shot out, gripping Mason's wrist in an iron hold. With a sharp twist, he forced the weapon away, the tendons in Mason's arms straining under the sudden pressure. Mason let out a grunt of frustration, trying to wrench himself free, but he was too slow. Chuck struck. Quick, precise, a stiff jab to the throat. Not enough to crush the windpipe, but enough to stun. Mason choked, his body seizing up. In that instant, Chuck swept his legs out from under him with a swift, calculated motion. Mason hit the floor hard, his back slamming against the wooden planks with a heavy thud. The knife clattered from his grip, spinning uselessly across the floor. For the first time since the fight began, Mason didn't get up. He just lay there, staring at the ceiling, his breath coming in shallow, uneven gasps. The room was silent. The remaining rockers, those who were still conscious, looked between their fallen leader and Chuck, their faces a mixture of shock and disbelief. Chuck took a step back, his expression unreadable. No words needed to be spoken. Mason groaned, rolling onto his side, his fingers twitching as if he wanted to reach for the knife. But he didn't. He knew it was over. The fight was done, and he had lost. For the first time in a long time, Mason Calloway had nothing left to say. Chuck turned, walking back toward the bar. Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out a few more bills and set them on the counter beside his untouched replacement cup of coffee. "For the mess," he said simply. The bartender, still wide-eyed from what he had just witnessed, gave a slow nod. Chuck picked up his coffee, took a sip, then set the cup back down. The bar was dead silent. No one dared move. No one dared speak. Even those who had stayed on the sidelines understood that they had just witnessed something different. Chuck Norris wasn't just a man passing through. He was something else entirely. And Mason Calloway, for all his bravado, had just learned that the hard way. Chuck turned toward the door, walking calmly across the battered floor. He pushed open the heavy wooden door and stepped outside, inhaling the cool night air. Behind him, inside the bar, Mason still lay motionless, staring blankly at the ceiling. For the first time in his life, he had nothing to say. Chuck Norris had already said everything that needed to be said. But instead of walking away, Chuck paused, then turned back toward the bar. He picked up the bills he had left earlier and placed them down again. "Get a new cup," he said to the bartender before sitting down as if nothing had happened. The bar remained silent, the air thick with the acrid scent of spilled alcohol and lingering cigarette smoke. An unnatural stillness settled over the room, broken only by the occasional groan of the fallen rockers. Mason Calloway lay sprawled on the floor, his breath coming in ragged bursts, knowing all too well that things would never be the same. Mason's body ached from the punishment he had just endured, but the real wound was to his pride. For years he had walked into bars like this and claimed his space without question. Fear had always been his weapon, his presence alone enough to command respect. People knew his name, his reputation. Few had ever dared to challenge him. Fewer still had bested him. Yet now here he was, gasping for air, staring at the ceiling, his body weighted down by the sting of defeat. And the man who had done it sat calmly at the bar, as if it had all been nothing more than an afterthought. Chuck Norris hadn't gloated, he hadn't taunted, he had simply done what needed to be done. And that, more than the pain in his ribs, more than the humiliation of being put on the floor, was what made Mason's blood boil. The smirk that usually rested on his face was gone, replaced by something harder, something darker. He had misread this man completely, had assumed him to be another traveler passing through, another stranger who didn't belong. But Chuck wasn't just some lost wanderer who had stepped into the wrong place. He was something else, something Mason couldn't quite define. And that unsettled him. Flexing his fingers against the wooden planks, he tested his limbs, feeling the slow throb of pain spreading through his muscles. He could have let it end there. He could have admitted defeat. But men like Mason Calloway didn't quit. They didn't accept losses. They took their victories, no matter what it cost. With a slow, measured breath, Mason rolled onto his side, then pushed himself up. His movements were deliberate, steady, controlled. He was hurt, but he wasn't finished. Chuck didn't turn to watch. He didn't have to. He simply lifted his coffee cup, the fresh one the bartender had placed in front of him, and took a sip, unbothered. Mason straightened to his full height, swaying slightly, his breath still uneven. His knuckles flexed, his jaw tightened, his mind racing. Strength alone hadn't worked. Experience hadn't been enough. Now there was only one thing left to try. One final play. Mason's fingers twitched toward his belt. The bartender, still frozen behind the counter, saw it first. His mouth opened as if to shout a warning, but no words came. The gleam of the knife caught the dim light. Mason's grip was sure, practiced. He wasn't the kind of man who hesitated with a weapon in his hand. He had used it before, and he would use it now. Chuck set his cup down, his movements as slow and deliberate as they had been from the moment he walked into the bar. He didn't look surprised. He simply looked disappointed. Then Mason lunged. The blade sliced through the air, a gleaming arc of cold steel aimed directly at Chuck's side. It was a strike meant to end things quickly, to shift the balance in an instant. But Chuck was already moving. With the precision of a man who had spent a lifetime knowing exactly how to react to danger, He shifted just enough to avoid the thrust. His body flowed effortlessly, each motion calculated. His hand shot out, fingers clamping around Mason's wrist in an iron grip. A sharp twist. Mason's fingers spasmed, the knife slipping from his grasp before he could even react. Chuck didn't give him a chance to recover. His other hand struck, a controlled but forceful jab to Mason's throat, not enough to crush his windpipe, but enough to stun him. Mason choked, his body seizing up for just a second. But that was all Chuck needed. With a swift, fluid motion, he swept Mason's legs out from under him, sending him crashing to the floor once more. This time, he didn't get up. The knife clattered uselessly across the wooden planks. Mason lay there, gasping, his chest rising and falling in uneven breaths. The remaining rockers, those still conscious, exchanged looks of shock and disbelief. Their leader, the man who had commanded fear and dominance, was on the floor, defeated. No one dared to move. Chuck took a step back, his expression unreadable. Mason groaned, rolling onto his side, his fingers twitching as if he wanted to reach for the knife again. But he didn't. He knew it was over. The fight was done. Mason Calloway had lost. He shut his eyes for a brief moment, letting the reality sink in. His body ached, his breath was uneven, but the worst wound was to his pride. Fear had always been his weapon, but tonight it had failed him. He had met someone who didn't flinch, didn't back down, and didn't need to prove a thing. Chuck turned back to the bar, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a few bills and placed them beside his untouched cup of coffee. "For the mess," he said simply. The bartender, still wide-eyed from what he had just witnessed, gave a slow nod. Chuck picked up his coffee, took a final sip, then set the cup down. The bar remained silent. No one dared to move. Even those who had stayed on the sidelines, watching from the shadows, understood they had just witnessed something different. This wasn't just another bar fight. This wasn't about dominance or pride. Chuck Norris wasn't just a man passing through. He was something else entirely. Without a word, Chuck turned toward the door, walking calmly across the battered floor. He pushed open the heavy wooden door and stepped outside, inhaling the crisp night air. The scent of dust and distant rain lingered, but inside, the tension remained thick, unmoving. Behind him, Mason still lay motionless. But moments earlier, just before his final fall, Mason had made one last mistake. He had reached for his knife. Chuck's grip had locked around Mason Calloway's wrist before the blade could redirect, twisting sharply with controlled but forceful precision. Mason's arm wrenched at an unnatural angle, and the knife clattered to the floor before he could even react. He barely had time to register the loss of his weapon before Chuck struck.